to have actually made the Zoom webinar accessible for all. Sorry, we're still kind of learning a little bit about how the technology will work. But in terms of this Mellon Fellowship, I wanted to also highlight our podcast, which is being streamed. We've already have one of our early podcasts, which is a conversation with our leadership, with Dr. Carla Britton, as well as Dr. Charles Monson-Russell, to think about what it means to be an individual coming home in terms of this fellowship and the goals of the Mellon Fellow. So today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lloyd Lee. Dr. Lloyd Lee is the editor of the Nihikéyah, which is Navajo Homeland. And in this book, Dr. Lloyd Lee is an enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation. He's a member of the Towering House clan, born from Red Chief people, and his grandfather's clan, Salt clan, and his paternal grandfather's is Water Edge clan. He's currently a professor and faculty graduate director in the Department of Native American Studies at University of New Mexico, and he's the director of the Center for Regional Studies and editor of the Wichita Review. He's also published quite a significant number of books, and today we do have the Nihikéyah for sale here for $20, and we'll be in the back selling those books. But he's also author of Diné Identity in the 21st Century World, Diné Masculinities, Conceptualizations and Reflections, co-author of Native Americans at the University of New Mexico, and he's also edited the Navajo Sovereignty, Understandings and Visions of the Diné People, and Diné Perspectives, Reclaiming and Revitalizing Navajo Thought. So much of his research does focus on Indigenous identity, masculinities, leadership philosophy, Native nation building, and Indigenous community building. I'm so grateful for your time, and I'd like us to all welcome Dr. Lloyd Lee.
Thank you very much, Dr. Breyes. Thank you to Diné College. Thank you to everyone for inviting me to share with you this new book that's coming out and some of my thoughts regarding Nihikéyah, Navajo Homeland. So let me go ahead and get started here. Go to the next slide, please. So let me go ahead and introduce myself in terms of the Diné language. Ki ani neshlen class chibashishi ashideshiche tobahe deshinala Diné neshlen. So I call my mom's home and my father's home both of my homes. So my mom is from Nashchidib, which is on the other side of the mountain range here. And so I call that home, and then also where my father's from, I call home, which is near Chichilpa area, which is south of Gallatin, north of Pueblo. And I spent a great deal of time in both places when I was younger, growing up and learning about our history, learning about our ceremonies, participating and being a patient in some ceremonies, learning about really what it means to be Diné, and also interacting with my relatives on both sides of my family, learning from them their experiences and their knowledge that they're willing to share. Right now, currently, I'm a professor in the Native American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico, and I've been at the University of New Mexico for 15 years now. Before that, I got started in my academic career at Arizona State University after 15 years. Then I transitioned over to UNM. I'm also the director for the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is an outreach center at UNM. It's been around since 1989. We do a lot of support for student fellowships, student scholarships, student research, as well as faculty. And we focus on the region of the Southwest and on a variety of different themes and different subjects. So we provide support for those types of scholarly work and promoting of events and activities at UNM and then in the Southwest. We actually have a a very unique program that we started a couple of years ago uh, uh, that we call the Tribal and Community College Research Scholar Program that Diné College is a part of. So Diné College, one of their faculty uh, goes to UNM to do some research on their work, and we provide the financial support and the resources there for one semester. That's something that we started a couple of years ago. We also have partnerships with Central New Mexico Community College and also um, San Jose Community College. So we're hoping to expand that out as we continue to go forward. And then also the editor for the Wichita Review Journal. Wichita Review is one of the first Native American Studies journals in the country. It started in 1985. Elizabeth Cookman was one of the founding editors, along with Roger Buffalo Head and William Willard and Beatrice Medicine. And it's been over almost 40 years now, and it's published at the University of Minnesota Press. We publish twice a year in the spring and the fall. We're trying to catch up in our latest editions. We just released 36-1, volume 36, number 1, just a couple of months ago, and we're hoping to release volume 36, number 2, at the end of the year, early January of next year. So that's just a little bit of my background and where I'm coming from. But I wanted to share with you about this Nihikéyah Navajo Homeland book. So this is actually part of a 4-part project. So when I started at ASU, I sat down and kind of wrote out what kind of projects did I want to work on. And the Navajo Nation and my background as an enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation, I wanted to focus on Navajo. And so the idea that came in mind at the time was to do a 4-part project. One focusing on our philosophy, our thought, our matrix. Another focus on the concept of sovereignty, because sovereignty is so important for the Navajo Nation as well as for indigenous peoples around the United States and around the Americas. I also wanted to focus on identity. It's important who we are, how we see ourselves, how we see both individually and part of a community. And then the 4th part would focus on our foundation. Really, our foundation is our homeland. It's our land, how we see it. So this is actually coming out now, and it's an important book because it really tries to emphasize the individual and the communal points of view when it comes to our homeland. I always see the Navajo Nation as sort of this United Nations. They're very diverse people. We grew up in various different places. We have different experiences with our ceremonies. We have different ways of speaking our language when it comes to certain terminologies and certain phrases. And so all that diversity really is important. And when I was putting the project together and thinking about all these different areas, I really wanted to include as many as different and diverse Navajo perspectives when we talk about our philosophy, our worldview, our thought, when we talk about the concept of sovereignty, when we talk about our homeland. And so that's the same case here with this particular book, is trying to include that set of diversity. So that's an important concept. Sat down and kind of thought about it, and really focusing our energy on the Navajo Nation. One of the things that I also want to mention is about the book cover, the art cover. This book, as well as the others, Diné Identity, Navajo Sovereignty, and then Diné Perspectives. Each one of these book covers was a cover piece that Renee Yazi did, and I really like her artwork. I think she really kind of tries to really focus on who we are as Diné people and where we come from, our history, our way of life. And so each one of those book covers really kind of represents what that book is about. So this one on the Navajo Homeland was a really beautiful piece that I saw that I recommended to University of Arizona Press to utilize as part of title page, the cover art. And so, because it's really, you know, the mountains, our land, our connection to those places is our strength, is how we see ourselves and how we connect to each other, how we connect to the land, how we connect to animals, plants, and herbs, and to other peoples, and to this world, to the earth, and to the universes and the galaxies that are out there. So I think it's important to really kind of show that with visual images as Diné people, as indigenous people. Our visual representation really is a connection to how we see ourselves and how we see our world. So I think it's important to have some type of visual representation. So let me go ahead and share with you about this book. So a couple of years ago, I began to contact people to see if they were interested in being a part of this anthology and sharing their thoughts and their experiences about how they see the land and how they connect to the land and what does it mean as part of their home. And so these questions kind of drove the initial connection. What are your thoughts and perspectives of Nihikéyah? What challenges does the Navajo Homeland face in the coming generation? What should all peoples know about the Navajo Homeland? And then, how do you see the Navajo Homeland building a positive and strong Navajo Nation, for the rest of the century and beyond? So those were the parameter questions, that I sent to contributors. They didn't necessarily have to just focus on those questions. It could expand further out. But this was just to get them going to thinking about, what should I focus on? What should I talk about? Because I really wanted them to share about, where they grew up or where they live now and what it means to them, how they connect to the land, how they connect to the social and economic and political environment that's part of that land. And I really wanted them to talk about what it means for them, because the Navajo Nation is the United Nations. Our diversity is our strength. It's not a deficit. It's not a way to kind of think of the Navajo Nation as not being unified. I don't see it that way. Our diversity is really our unification. And so, yes, there are challenges that come up with that. I don't want to dismiss that because there is some there. But that diversity is important because people, where they grew up, let's say they grew up around, my mom's home community, Nashchili, they're going to have a very different take on how they see the world, how they see the land, versus those that live and grew up in, let's say, a Lee area in Arizona, closer to the coast of Texas. So those experiences are important to recognize and acknowledge. So I wanted to kind of bring that diversity out, and these questions really will just kind of provide the framework of what they were going to think about. So these are the contributors to the book. I tried to get as many contributors as possible. One of the challenges of being an editor for any anthology or for any book is setting a deadline and keeping to that deadline to make sure that you get the information that you need to the publisher to be printed. And so one of the challenges is making sure that contributors stick to a timeline. And in many cases, some contributors are not able to do that. So because they're not able to do that, or something comes up, their piece is not in the anthology. So this 8 contributors, I'm so thankful for them for contributing their chapters and their essays. But there were others that I asked and they just couldn't be able to participate in the time frame that we had set up. But these these 8 individuals are amazing. They share a variety of different perspectives when it comes to talking about the homeland. It's organized in a way that reflects who we are as Diné people in our way of thinking and our philosophy. And so the way it's organized, it starts in the east, goes to the south, then the west, and then up to the north. So each one of these contributors grew up in that region or live there now. And they talk about their experiences in that area and what they wanted to share that's important. So we start with the East, and we start with Mr. Jonathan Perry. He used to be a former Navajo Nation Council delegate for the area. But he talks about the importance of his home and why he stays there and why he lives there and how he communicates with people in the area and how he tackles the challenges that they face in their region. And what those lands and those areas for him, what kind of stands out, and what is important for them, and how they need to sustain it and protect it. Okay, and then we go to Mario Atencio, who's also from the eastern part of Navajo land, and he talks about the challenges of pollution and how they are monsters for the health and well-being of the people that live in that region. He talks about fracking. He talks about oil extraction, the environmental devastation that's taking place in his home community and in other places that are part of the eastern part of Navajo land, and that there needs to be changes. And the federal government has a responsibility to make those changes, to protect the people, to protect their health, to protect their well-being. And so his piece really kind of focuses on that. Then we go to the south, and we have two pieces that focus on both the philosophical and poetic way of connection between Navajo individuals and communities to the homeland, and the importance of the way that we think about homeland in our language, in our thought, and the way we talk, the way that we speak. So Jake Skeets really kind of brings in his poetry, brings in his reflections of where he grew up and how he sees the Navajo homeland, and how his way of thinking about the land through poems, through poetry, really strengthens the way he sees himself as a Diné person, and how the people see themselves in terms of their identity and their way of life. And then Manny Lola talks about all of the connections that we have with land, right? The air, the land itself, the rain that comes down on the land, everything that we can think of in terms of existential and physical embodiment of how human beings connect to the environment, to the earth, and how our language really kind of demonstrates that connection, right? In Diné Bazad, we talk about our families, we talk about what we see on the land, where we gather firewood, where we gather medicine from our plants and our herbs, and how that language is important to establishing that type of relationship with the land itself and connecting our understanding of connection to them, right? It delves into that. Then we move to the west, and we have Sean Adekai and Wendy Gray Eyes. And in this particular section, Sean Adekai really talks about the settler colonial aspect of the United States to Navajo people, and the challenges that the Navajo people and the Navajo Nation faces in terms of Western law and the legality of protecting our land and maintaining it, and trying to get rid of this notion of trust land status, that the federal government is not the owner of this land. In fact, they stole this land and claimed it for itself, when in fact it really belongs to the Diné people and to indigenous peoples. And he really kind of brings up the fact that our mindset, the Navajo people's mindset, has to change and make sure that we think of it in those terms rather than sort of this Western law format, Western law legal framework of reservation land status, trust land status, and stuff like that. And then Dr. Gray Eyes in her piece really focuses on the process of how we develop home site leasing, and that process being so bureaucratic, so Western, and that there is an approach that needs to be taken from a Diné point of view, a Diné philosophical, Diné thought of understanding how we are related to the land, rather than going and taking the bureaucratic process that's now in place and how convoluted that is, and how in a lot of ways for many Navajo people and Diné people, it's such a huge barrier that for some they're not able to get home site leasing. And the challenges with home site leasing when it comes to raising rights and to all of the challenges when people confront each other regarding, this is where we're supposed to be, that's where you're supposed to be, and there should be no collision, no interaction, when in fact, that's not how our ancestors did it, right? That's not how our 200-300 years ago, in terms of establishing relationships, establishing strong connections through our extended family networks, and making sure that we share this relationship and the sharing of this land and what it provides for us. So that chapter really kind of goes into the challenges with the bureaucratic system that we have now. And then the last section, the northern section, we have Rex Lee Jim and Jennifer Jackson Wheeler. And so Rex Lee, as you know, works here at Diné College. And he brings in really some really important stewardship knowledge, cultural knowledge that he has of where he grew up, where he lives, how he utilizes that knowledge in terms of his teachings, in terms of his medicine healing that he provides, and the importance of understanding that knowledge when it comes to family, when it comes to our Diné cultural ways. And then Jennifer Jackson Wheeler, I think, is really interesting piece because she takes a very creative nonfiction approach to talking about the land, where she talks about her family and she brings in different stories and narratives and how the land is part of the family. It's a relative. It's not something that's separate from the way that we think about the physical and the non-physical, or the way that we think of when it comes to human and non-human. I think the way that she tells it in this creative approach really kind of drives that point across, that our connections, the Native people's connections to our homeland, to the land itself, is never going to be severed because it's always part of our family in that way. So these are the contributors to this book, and I hope that you get a chance to read it, that you'll also have some of those connections, they resonate with you, and your experiences where you grew up or where you live now, and the importance of that. Like I said, it's organized, based on the Navajo philosophy of learning that everyone here, I hope, is very much aware of here at Diné College, right? The orientation, is sunwise. When we think of orientation, right, where we start, how we see ourselves, where we're going. It's very much, the Navajo way of thinking of orientation, following the sun. So the book is organized into Pa'a, Shara'a, now coast, east, south, west, and north. And then, like I said, all of the contributors either grew up in that region, that area, or they live there now. So you're getting very much a connection to those places what they talk about. Like I said, each one of these chapters really kind of focuses on a variety of different subjects and different themes. So the first chapter with Mr. Perry, takes that individual land perspective, the cultural teachings that he knows related to those areas and the challenges that those areas face, those communities face in that region. Chapter 2, right, defending the land from the pollution monsters. We see that constant um, barrage happening, and how do you counter that, right? How do you counter that? Chapter 3, talking about the language, talking about memory, our memory to these places, mapping, right? Our own verbal maps, our own visual maps of these places that we call home. What happened here, this plant over here, where, this herb over here, this family's home was over here, those types of ties. Chapter 4, the rain, the language, the time as part of the way that we think about land, storytelling, those types of things in that chapter. Chapter 5, talking about settler colonialism, oppression, the injustice of Western legal frameworks. Chapter 6, again, talking about the process, the bureaucratic process with home site leasing, and how we need to advocate a more Diné-centric way of thinking about this process. Chapter 7, talking about the cultural knowledge, the tethering to the land. And then chapter 8, our family, our essential way of being, our relationality when it comes to our narratives and to our stories. Because it's very important that each family, each Diné individual document and these narratives, talk about these stories, talk about those connections to the land, to the home, to each other, because really that strengthens our way of life, that strengthens our sovereignty, strengthens who we are about. It's important, and I'm hoping that this is in the book. I talk about in the conclusion section about 4 implications that I feel are important. One of those implications has to do with documentation of our family narratives when it comes to where we live, where we grew up, and the importance of that. And all of that being housed here on Navajo, right? Being housed here at Diné College, right? In the Ruth and Bob Russell Archival Center, for example, or at Navajo Technical University in Crown Point. Those institutions are really important to the Navajo Nation, and the resources that need to be provided to those institutions because of work that's important, like these family narratives and documenting. So also in the introduction, I wanted to mention this. So in the introduction, I talk about our history. Early on in the emergence and journey narratives, I utilize Ethel Yazzi's work with the communities in this region, in this area, when they began to talk to different individuals, men and women, medicine people, about our emergence and our journey narratives, right? And this was all documented way back in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And then the book came out, right? Navajo History, Volume 1. So a lot of those emergence and journey narratives come from that particular text. And it's important because it documents a portion of our narratives. It doesn't document the whole thing, but it's a portion that comes from our people and our ancestors. And so when you talk about our history, it's important to really recognize that. And then I go into the pre-Long Walk era and then the post-Long Walk era, the reservation era. And this is important too as well because a lot of that type of history focuses specifically on American history or European history when it comes to interaction with Diné people and other indigenous peoples. But Diné people, indigenous peoples know that history. It's in our stories, it's in our narratives, it's in our families. And so we're really trying to emphasize the point of that type of history to make sure that our connections to the land, to our way of life, to our languages are paramount. And I think it's important. So I kind of talk about those things in the book. I also talk about in the introduction as well as the conclusion, the challenges that our land faces, Nihikéyah faces. And one of those challenges has to do with Western acculturation. So I think in certain chapters in books, particularly chapter 5 and 6 in the book, really bring this out. This Western acculturation, the Western legal framework, settler colonialism, oppression, the bureaucratic process, the Western process with home site leasing, trying to advocate for a more Diné-centric way of thinking about land and thinking about how we establish home sites and grazing rights and all of those things. So that's a challenge. That's something that's ongoing, something that we as a people, we as a nation, the council delegates, the president, all of them have to come together and think about how do we change the way of thinking about our connection to the land and thinking about home sites and thinking about grazing rights in a positive way that's acknowledging and respecting everyone. Because our ancestors did that 300, 400 years ago. And because of Western systems, we've really kind of categorized these things and kind of separated them. And so that's definitely a challenge. How do you change it to a way that's no longer the case? Another challenge that I talk about is sort of this economic development, right? If you look at the history of economic development on Navajo, it started off with mineral extraction, right? Oil, right? Gas. Later on, coal, and then uranium, and then coal, right? All of these mineral extractions. And we're still dealing with the after effects, right? In certain parts of Navajo Homeland, it's ongoing, right? Like I said, Mario Atencio talks about that in the eastern part of Navajo Homeland. And then the variety of economic projects that has an impact on the land itself, right? And that's a challenge because people need to make a living, need to live, need to provide food and shelter and clothing to their families and to their loved ones. So how do you do that in a way that's respectful of the homeland, of the land itself, and in a way that's comfortable for us the way that we live our lives today, right? Because of all of this technology, right? The Zoom, like the camera and the internet, all this stuff. How do we do that? That kind of creates a more positive way of living with the land, with our environment and stuff like that. And then the last thing I talk about, it's not the only last challenge. But it's a challenge nonetheless today, sustaining the land. How do we sustain the land? How do we make sure that the land is safe for our people, that it's not hurtful, right? That it's not, because there's still hundreds of uranium mines that haven't been cleaned up, right? That are all across different parts of Navajo Homeland. Mineral extraction, fracking, oil and gas, right? In certain parts of the Navajo Homeland, that's still taking place. How do we sustain the land to make sure that it's a protection, that it's always been a protection for our people? How do we do that today? And so that's a challenge, because that really entails everyone, all of us, to think about how do we sustain it and make sure that it's protected and it provides that positive well-being that it was designed for. Then I also, in the conclusion section, I really kind of talk about the future and the present. So our homeland is our foundation for Navajo Nation building, right? We are building a Navajo Nation. We've been doing this in the system that we have now for 100 years. How do we make sure that it stays as a priority? It should be the first thing that we think about when we think about Navajo Nation building. Is our homeland. How's that done? And how do we get every decision that we make reflective of that, right? Both in terms of our communities and our chapter houses, Navajo Nation Council, the President's Office, all of those things. It's important to allow and recognize and respect a diversity of perspectives, because this diversity has always been with us. I think we kind of sometimes get siloed and have this narrow thinking process that there's only one Navajo way to be Navajo. And the reality is that's never been the case for us in our history. Our diversity of who we are as Diné people has always been there. And sometimes we forget that. And we get caught into that either or type of paradigm, right? You either have to be Navajo, you either have to do this or don't. And that's not how it's always been, right? So it's important to acknowledge that. Like I said, family narratives, recordings maintained for prosperity, that's extremely important, because a lot of our elders, a lot of our people who have that knowledge, who have those stories, they're not being documented, they're not being maintained, and a lot of that knowledge is lost. And so I think it's important that families do this. You know, this is not about a scholar coming into the home and saying, okay, I'm going to record we're going to do a recorded oral history project, and I'm going to write a book on this. No, that's not what I'm advocating. I'm saying every single Diné family documents their own family's history. It stays with them. And the best way to do that is to use our technology, is to use the written word, is to use the modern technology. It stays with you. Now, if you want to share that and with other Diné families, with other Diné people, then definitely Diné College here, Navajo Tech, those are places where those can be maintained and not being sent off the reservation, off our homeland, like to Harvard or to UNM or to ASU or to NNU. Those things can stay here. And then the last thing, all decision making needs to follow the land as a foundation of a Diné way of life. That's a challenge because of what I've mentioned before, right? With economic development, with sustaining the land, if you try to make every decision following the land as the foundation, there are people who will push back to that, saying, well, if you do that, then you can't have all of these things that we have that we need. Well, it's not about preventing those things. It's about doing those things in a positive and healthy way. And if you can do it in a positive, healthy way, if the decision making always follows the land as the foundation of that. And the way that comes, where does that come from? That comes from the families that live in those regions. What they're willing to share, what they're willing to provide to the people to understand what this place means to them, what they've experienced, what knowledge that they're willing to provide to help in this process. So it can be done. It's really about dialogue, it's about conversation, it's about sharing those things in a positive way for the families, for the community, for the homeland. Okay, well, thank you. This is my contact, and you can see my email and phone number there. But I'm also open for any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much for your talk and for your book on this, really important topic right now. So I have two questions. One is just a practical question. I hear the homeland sometimes described as Diné or Nihikéyah, or the title of your book. Is there a distinction between those three? That's my...
Yes, there are distinctions between those technologies. I think when you use those certain phrases and certain terminologies, you're referencing specific experiences, specific places. So the Nihikéyah is really it's about the entire community and our connections to the land that we walk upon. It's our home. So for me, that's the more proper terminology to talk about the Navajo homeland. Nihikéyah is a term that is really uh, designed to really kind of let non-Navajo people, non-Diné people know about this is a place that Navajo people reside. And you know, the next is in referencing to our creation narratives, right? Our journey narratives and our emergence. And so those as a specific location, a specific experience tied to that.
Thank you. And my other question, you know, like in the mainstream Anglo world, there's lots of concern about eco-anxiety. You know, I think there's concern about the future of our world, the future of our environment, and what, you know, human activity has done. Is there a similar concept in Navajo, or a similar idea of this kind of eco-anxiety at this moment?
I don't think they would call it that. I don't. You know, I think when you hear our narratives, both in terms of our different families, and then also our Christian narratives, they talk about the challenges that we faced and how we've overcome them. And those narratives are really important to kind of give people the knowledge and the strength to say, yes, we're going to be dealing with all of these different things that come up in our life because it's always been there, right? All of these challenges, right? One of the biggest ones, right, being climate change, right? With the southwest regions becoming more drier, less precipitation, right? Less rain, less snow. What does that change in terms of the environment? How does that impact ourselves? How does that impact animals, right? Our livestock. So those are definitely things in the minds of many people, but I don't think they would see that as anxiety. They would see that as, well, this is what's happening now. We look at our narratives and our history. This is how our ancestors dealt with challenges that they were facing that were similar to those. And so those narratives can provide a base, a foundation, and a strength to how to create the plans and the ideas, how to overcome what we're facing right now. Yes.
So I just want to say, firstly, thank you for bringing your book for us to purchase today. I was looking forward to getting this book, but I thought it wasn't available until October next week. So, thank you. Also, the question that I would like to ask is, United Nations, you refer to that in the book, but what do you mean by United Nations? Obviously, we have tribal nations, Navajo Nation, but in your terminology, what do you mean by that? United.
Well, you know, in reference to Navajo Nation, I see it as the United Nations. Because if you look at our history, you look at the way that we govern, the way that our families interacted, they were pretty regional, right? They were set up in extended family networks. You had different families that lived close by. When we conducted ceremonies, it was usually involving those families. It wasn't involving families 500-600 miles away, right? And so those experiences are related to that particular location, that particular environment. So there's going to be some slight differences versus other families who were located, 300 or 400 or 500 miles away. And but that does not represent what it means to be Diné. Does not dissuade from the fact that we're all Diné people. We all have these ceremonies and experiences, and that all of it is Diné, all of it is Navajo. And so coming together as a central governing unit has only been in place for about 100 years now, right? When the first Navajo, or when the first business council was formed in 1923, and then the subsequent reforms and amendments to Navajo government ever since then. So we're still in the process of trying to refine that. What does that mean for us as Diné people? Right? What does that mean in terms of a structure that we want? And it's something that's still ongoing, and our diversity is evident in the way that it functions, right? And so we have to think of it, at least the way I interpret it in my mind, is as a United Nations, right? You have, you see it play out in a lot of different ways, right? One of the most basic ways that it plays out is our clan system, right? Because in the past, long ago, when Kiani people talked about their history and their ceremonies, they were talking about Kiani people. They weren't talking about Ashian or Mutgishgizhi or any of those other groups of clans, right? They were talking about their clan system. Now, in the last 100 years, all of us are kind of thrust together because of schooling, because of education, because of employment, because of the government restricting us, right, in terms of being on the long walk, putting us onto a concentration camp right across the Redondo. All of those things, you began to see changes start to happen where all of a sudden now you had groups of Navajo people who never interacted with others start to interact with each other. And you begin to develop new ways of living, new systems. So in that sense, you still have this diversity, even 160 years later, right? So that's the way I kind of see it.
Just that leads to my next question. I appreciate your answer and how you reference diversity among Navajo Nation and within Navajos. We have, of course, traditional Christian, and even those who explore different other religions out there. So within that diversity of Navajo Nation, I also want to reference your topic of challenges to Navajo Nation and the land itself. And I just wanted to say that within the challenges of land, I think too, would you say accessibility is a challenge in itself? Because right now you have more than half of Navajo Nation who live off, and even just that challenge to come back and establish a home site. I think, Dr. Ray mentioned within her chapter about home site leases. And I just wanted to make that reference and get your take on the diversity and how accessibility to land could be a challenge with some Navajo families today. So it's not really a question, but
yeah, I think accessibility, yes, is a part of the challenges, and it points to that system that we have now in place, right, which is a very bureaucratic Western system. And I think, chapter 6 that Dr. Gray Eyes writes about her experiences with that and how we need to create a system that doesn't follow that we can create a system that's Diné-centric, that reflects our family, that reflects relations, that reflects Keh, right? And that is really a connection to the way that our ancestors interacted with each other long ago, right, in terms of differences and different experiences. The challenge that's tied to accessibility has to do, I think, with other different elements as well. So one of those elements has to do with infrastructure, right? One of the things that you hear a lot from a lot of Navajo people who don't live on the homeland is the infrastructure, right? very few jobs, right? There's very few places to live. You have to go through the home site leasing process, and that takes years, right? Possibly years. And there's issues with grazing rights, all of those things. And, what if the family or the individual doesn't want to have grazing rights, right? They want to take care of livestock. All of those things play into the way that some people may think about coming back home or not coming back home in that sense, right? So that's one element of it. Another element has to do with opportunities, right? They may not see being on the homeland as having the same opportunities that they would have, let's say, versus living in a larger city someplace else, like Phoenix, for example. So in that sense, it is complex in terms of it. And accessibility creates that complexity. Or actually doesn't create it. It's a consequence of that complexity. And so we see that today. How do you deal with that? How do you overcome that? That is something that we as the Diné people need to talk about. How do we do this? How do we make sure that for those individuals that want to have accessibility to being home, to having the infrastructure in place, having the opportunity to live there, that's provided. Because right now, that's a big, that's not quite answered yet. And we should try to answer it. And it involves everything.
I'm going to choose one question off of the Zoom. We have, I think, 4. So one that I find is interesting. It says, with more than half of the 400,000 enrolled Diné people living off the nation, how does this book reflect the lives of those people? I wonder if they're thinking and experiencing changes about Nihikéyah.
They are experiencing those changes and experiences because for more than half of the Navajo population that doesn't live on the homeland, they have family here. They have relatives. They have grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, uncles. I'm sure a lot of them come home for birthday parties, for celebrations, for funerals, for ceremonies, and they come here and they spend time here, right? And so there's not a disconnect. It's not like they refuse to be a part of the homeland or refuse to come back. I would doubt anyone would feel that way. Of course, I may be wrong, but they have connections, right? They have family and relatives here, and they come and visit, and they come and share experiences here. So I don't think they're disconnected. I don't think they're like severed from those experiences. Now, the question about accessibility, the question about trying to find a home here, yeah, those are definitely challenges that they face if they want to come back. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So thank you for the presentation. My name's Cyrus Snowcross. And I actually had a question specifically on the economic development. What exactly are some of the ways that you plan on influencing the division of Navajo Nation the economic division? What are some of from the book, have you had talks with the division of economics? Like, what are some of the plans that you guys have to move forward?
Well, that question has been really kind of through all of the books, all of the edited books I have, and then even including the identity one. I think with economic development, we kind of get trapped into thinking we have to involve some type of mineral extraction as part of it, right? Because that's sort of where it started, right? With oil exploration, and then you have Western American companies coming in and extracting that oil. And then later on, you got the federal government coming in, extracting uranium. And then in the 50s and 60s, you got other companies coming in, they extract coal. In other words, the economic foundation of Navajo government, Navajo Nation, has always included mineral extraction, which to me has always been a way to kind of constrain the way we think about development or economic growth, right? Because we've always kind of come back to that. Now, recently in the last 30 years, 40 years, there's been a growth of Navajo enterprises that the Navajo government has done, although they're pretty small and they're pretty limited in terms of the number of employees that they've hired, right? People who work for those enterprises. That's not to say that they're not important, because they are. But we have to kind of think of economic growth in a more comprehensive way that involves things that our communities are in need of, right? One of those is healthcare, right? Our healthcare system is run predominantly by the Indian Health Service, right? And that we do have some small clinics on Navajo, different communities that the Navajo Nation government is involved in, right? But in terms of hospital care, major care, surgery, stuff like that, Indian Health Service still has those connections. Okay, so that's the system that we have in place. How do we create a connection to that Indian Health Service that's in lieu of clinics, right? In lieu of support networks? You can do that, right? You can create more of a comprehensive nature of that, right? I mean, we have that in certain communities, in certain places, but not on a comprehensive level. It's not in all Navajo communities, right? If we created something like that where it's in all Navajo communities, it's also connected to Navajo people who don't live on Navajo. Maybe they live in Phoenix, maybe they live in Flagstaff, maybe they live in Albuquerque, wherever, where everyone who's Navajo sees the importance of being a part of this type of economic growth that impacts the Navajo Nation, right? So what I'm trying to say is that we have to think of these economic growth ideas in a more comprehensive way, where it involves the entire Navajo Nation, the entire set of our communities, right? Right now, I think in certain locations, in certain places, we've focused on certain things to kind of create that economic growth, like in the Window Rock area, like in Chinle, like in Shiprock, right, in Tuba City and Kayenta and some other places. But you don't see that across the board, right? You don't see that in other locations. Now, of course, there are challenges to that, right? Because then there are certain laws that come into play, right? Well, you need to get, the federal government to approve this. Well, that shouldn't be a stopping point, right? Because our ancestors have always negotiated and talked with the federal government, and we've always been very successful, all right? And so it shouldn't be seen as a barrier. And said, okay, we're not going to get these things because the federal government is not going to, allow us to do that. That's just not true. You look at our history; we've always talked to the federal government, and we've been victorious many times with the federal government. And it's because our dialogue, it's because we constantly communicate, this is what's needed, this is what our people need. And it's been effective, right? We also utilize our prayers, our spirituality. Sometimes we forget that these decisions, these ideas involves our ceremonies, it involves our language, it involves our prayers, and the importance of that, the strength that it gives to us, right? And so that's what I mean by a comprehensive approach to economic growth, is that you got to think of it in those ways rather than just sort of using the law as sort of the barrier to it, or using the bureaucratic system as a barrier, because that needs to be changed to where we think of, okay, how do we get this done, rather than this is stopping us, right? But I also think that the mineral extraction part of it has always sort of created this thought process that this is, when it comes to economic growth, this is the only approach that, or one of the approaches that we need to take. And it's like, no, not necessarily. There are places around the world there is no mineral extraction and they have economic growth. We can utilize those experiences.
Yeah, so the second question to that is, so I understand the comprehensive want to have economic growth. Have you had spoken with any urban planners within the Navajo Nation, people who can help plan these types of ideas that you're presenting to not just the communities, but to the Navajo Nation government as well? Have you worked with a lot of urban planners, or how's that working?
No, I have not. There are certain planning programs, planning entities that can be utilized to make sure that that discussion takes place, right? One of them is at the University of New Mexico, the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute, right? That's housed in the School of Architecture and Planning. They do a lot of discussions with um, different communities in the region in the Southwest, both Pueblo and Navajo and Apache. They've had a long history of students working with those different communities and different governing systems. So that's one way we can kind of create that type of discussion and interaction. I think the Navajo government, in a lot of ways, needs to do a better job of knowing what is out there that they can go to work with other indigenous peoples, with other Navajo people, because sometimes we kind of get thinking, oh well, it all has to be commercialized, it has to be different state entities have to be involved in all those things. Yes, they have to be involved as part of the discussion, but the people need to be driving this. The people in the community need to be driving this, and it's who they want to work with, right? In that sense, so we have to acknowledge that.
This gentleman over there.
Yes.
Good evening. I had a question. You're talking about a lot of topics relating to that. So as it comes down to tribalism, detribalization kind of process when it comes down to homeland, being off the res, being on the res, detribalization concept, and also with those areas, different areas, politics, government entities, those kind of things. I always wanted to see what your perspective would be on those terms. I guess tribalism, I guess you could say. Being on the res, you're supposed to be like res kind of version, I guess you could say. And then you go off the res, and you'll go to college, whatever. You join something else. You're kind of being detribalized in that process as well. Where is that kind of detribalization kind of? And so I think some of those topics kind of unique, and I was kind of want to see what your perspectives are.
Yeah. That really falls into that either or paradigm trap that I mentioned, in the sense that, there are terminologies and descriptions that we use to kind of categorize us, right? Like reservation, urban, right? Full blood, mixed blood. These are terminologies that we hear a lot. And in a lot of ways, those terminologies are designed to divide us, right? In the sense that you're either or, when in fact all of us are both and. And so tribalism, detribalizing, those are terms that we use to kind of categorize how we see things happening. But the reality is that today in our world now, many Diné people, many indigenous people in this country have experiences that are similar, that are their influences, their impacts are similar, right? In the sense that many people on the reservation watch television, watch streaming services, watch movies that are westernized in Hollywood, right? Versus, and the same for those that live in the city, right? So those things that they see, those things that they read, those things that they engage with, all of that influences the way they think about life, the way that they think about other people, the way they think about their community, the way they think about their identity. That's not to say that it's wrong or bad or anything. It's just the way that it is now. So, I think the other thing that kind of falls into that tribalism, detribalizing is like, the two worlds paradigm, right? When you're on the reservation, the rural area, you have to be one way, and then when you go off the reservation or in the city, you have to be another way, right? These two worlds. Well, that's always been a misnomer to me, just based on my experiences, based on my research and all of that, because Indigenous people don't change in the sense that what is important for them as an Indigenous person, as a Diné person, will always be the same wherever they go. And so the culture, the language is important. It's going to be the same way whether you're living in Chinle versus whether you're in Phoenix, right? Because it's important to them. It's important to their family, important to their individual. So in that sense, I don't like to kind of utilize those types of terminologies because I think it just divides us even more. Thank you for it. It's an important question. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank Dr. Lee so much for his time. We do have books for sale. They're very much discounted. They're $20 a book. But if you are joining us virtually, the books are $24.95. They are available at University of Arizona Press, and you can Google it or on even Amazon.com. They are available right now. But I just wanted to also recognize that Diné College also streams a lot of really wonderful events like this. So I really do encourage you to follow Diné College at diné.college or the Diné College President's site at Diné College President on Facebook for future events. But we're really grateful to the team here and especially Dylan Nopa for being our Facebook live streamer. So thank you so much. And we just want to give Dr. Lloyd Lee a round of applause. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Andrew Curley, and he produced the book called Coal Sovereignty, which will be on Tuesday, November 21st, here in the Ned Hatofli room, the first floor, and there will be plenty of refreshments. We will also have his books for sale. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you in 1 month. Take care. Oh, yes. So if anybody would like to buy a book, we'll be here, and Lloyd will be signing books as well. So if you guys want to, yeah. So Venmo is everything is here for everything. So we can do Venmo, PayPal.
Thanks for taking it. We had a lot of questions.